Welcome to Truth Unto Godliness. I'm your host, Michael. In this episode, we'll present our guest, Father James, here for the first time on the channel. I hope you'll share the link or maybe share the channel if you appreciate the content we're making here. But I'm really looking forward to discussing one of the very central aspects of the Christian life, namely the holy ministry. What is it? What is it about? And to discuss that, I have brought on our guest for the first time on the channel, Father James. Thank you so much for coming on and taking the time.
Sure thing. Thank you for having me. I love the background over there. Is that what is that right there, right behind you? To your
This?
yeah.
Yeah. Wine.
Oh, wine cellar. Nice.
Yes.
Love it.
Yes, I'm as a Dane, I prefer beer, but maybe I think during the last 5 years or so, I've picked up an interest for wine. So for birthdays and Christmas and so on, I always wish for some good bottles, which I find irresponsible to use our own money to purchase. So, but for gifts, it's a great idea.
My favorite drink of choice, alcoholic, is cider. I love any sort of good cider.
Yeah. Do you know what Calvados is? It's a distilled cider from France.
What's it called again?
Calvados.
Calvador. It's a distilled cider from France. I'll have to check into it. I guess it's got much more of a kick.
Yeah, so whiskey is pretty much distilled beer without hops.
Yeah.
And then you probably also know cognac.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, cognac is distilled white wine from France, but they make a lot of cider in Normandy, so they distill the cider as well, and it's one of my favorite drinks. I mean, sorry for all the commercials, but this one is one it's not too expensive, but I mean, for the money, I mean, you just get so much good quality for in comparison, because cognac is so expensive because it's so popular. Also globally, but almost no one knows about Calvados, so the prices are really good.
I'll have to definitely look into that and see if my local ABC store and stuff like that will have it. Definitely.
Yeah.
Oh.
But then, do you want to introduce yourself, because you are actually part of the holy ministry, which we will discuss today? So that's excellent.
Yes. Well, I'm Father James. I run the Barely Protestant YouTube channel. Also, I am a priest. I am actually in the midst of transition right now, going from one parish to another. So keep me in prayer for that, because I'm still settling on which parish I'm going to ultimately decide to be a part of and serve at. But yeah, I was born an independent fundamental Baptist and became Anglican back in 2012. Was when I was confirmed. And at that point, I had already from like a very young time as a child, I sensed the call to ministry. But then it sort of rekindled when I looked into the liturgical sacramental tradition, and then eventually became Anglican. And so, 2017, I went to seminary. I went to Trinity School for Ministry, which is much more of an evangelical type of Anglican seminary, and then graduated right in the midst of the beginning of the pandemic. I graduated, so 2020, and so pretty much my entire ordained life, I was ordained as a deacon in 2019, so at the very end of 2019. But pretty much almost my entire ordained life has been COVID related. Yeah. So that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, so it must have been very nice to come back then from the COVID pandemic and all that.
Well, I mean, I live in California currently. California is very lockdown obsessed. Very much like, yeah, they love locking things down.
Even more reason to keep you in our prayers.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I mean, you've heard, like, I know churches that are bigger than the one I'm currently serving at, where they were fined locally, like just a few miles away from where I live. Where they were fined like $1,000 for each day that they were open and things like that.
Wow.
That's
awful.
And I'm like, it's been kind of, it's not my cup of tea. I didn't grow up in California. I'm not accustomed to that. Yeah.
But so then, coming from a more low church Baptist background, I'm sure you have heard so many times, probably also from family members and the like, that, oh, why be ordained? Why put on a collar? Why all those vestments? Aren't we just all priests? I mean, why make it so special? Isn't it just a kind of maybe Pharisaic, Old Testament clericalism to try and put on one member of the congregation up on a pedestal? Can't you just walk in with your business suit and have healthy men matured in the faith go up and share the responsibilities from the congregation? Oh no, the connection seems to have gone down with our guest. That is not so good. At least not when I'm trying to ask a rhetorical question. I'll just see. Let's see here. The connection went away. I am afraid. Okay, let's see if we can't get our pastor back here. That was not so good. Okay. Yeah. Always annoying when we are doing a live stream and we are having technical issues. But that being said, yeah, he dropped out. I hope he will rejoin the link here. So, regardless of that, having our guest returning quite soon, I hope then we should be able to continue the discussion. Sorry for the listeners and the viewers waiting. Can you rejoin? So the rhetorical question I was asking Father James is probably a question familiar to most of the viewers, also if they are coming from a more low church background, because seemingly there is somewhat of a tension between the clerical estate, we might call it, that is those who are ordained, whether that is to the priesthood, the diaconate, and the like, and then on the other hand, how it is a real reality that all Christians are priests, that all Christians are that all Christians who are believers are in a certain sense. Oh, he's back. Welcome back, Father James. Are you able to hear me?
I can hear you now. Yeah.
Yes.
I was hearing you the entire time, but I guess you couldn't hear me. Like it was smooth on my end.
Yeah, it fell out.
I don't know what happened.
One of our one of our viewers wrote a comment saying that it is apparently a habitual problem. Is the internet bad in California?
Apparently, yeah. No, it's weird. So it's actually more just, I guess, where I live in the apartment.
Okay.
I don't want to go to the school late at night and stuff like that. Although every now and then it's happened that Wi-Fi is not reliable at the church. I don't know what it shouldn't be bad. This is in the middle of Silicon Valley, so like this is where all the tech people, yeah. But like I have never had as many problems connecting to the internet as I've had in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, that's wild. So,
but yeah, okay, I'm going off my 4G. But
yeah. But if the audio came through well, then you were able to hear the question about
so about the priesthood of all believers and all that. And it's important to note that like this is something that was recovered by the Reformation. Luther himself points to the priesthood of all believers. It is something that we cannot deny, and in fact, even Rome today holds to the understanding of the priesthood of all believers. And there is a problem with clericalism that you see within sort of late medieval Roman tradition. So, like, I sympathize with the concerns about a sort of clericalism, but that is not to say that therefore sort of any distinction between clergy and laity is sort of clericalism. And I'll just give a few examples. If you look at the requirements that are for clergy within the pastoral epistles and such, you'll see that there's a bit of a higher standard for there is that separate, and we are actually judged even more harshly because we are teachers and such, according to St. Paul. And we see those sorts of different standards set upon clergy where where there is more to be expected from us. So there is a distinction between clergy and laity. And on top of that, even if it comes to things like dress, so I don't know if you can see it, I'm wearing the collar, and that distinguishes me as a clergyman. Now, this is me speaking more to sort of the traditional, say, Baptists and Presbyterians, who would wear a suit and tie and everything like that. If you, as the pastor of a Baptist church or Presbyterian church or Methodist church, just sort of go up to your pulpit and you're wearing jeans, ripped jeans and a t-shirt and all that sort of stuff, that's not going to generally go over very well in a sort of very traditional Baptist or traditional Presbyterian church. Maybe traditional might not be the best word. Sort of, I guess you could say, more conservative one. I mean, that'll work in a sort of non-denom church and everything like that. But the reason that doesn't work so well in a sort of more conservative church is that we recognize that as the pastor, you are an example for the rest of the church. And so, wearing the collar, when I'm driving, I have to make sure that I'm driving well and I'm not having road rage and things like that. I have to just make sure that I'm representing Christ well when I'm wearing the collar in public. And there are times where I don't want to wear the collar because I don't want to have to be worrying about how I'm acting. But it reminds me to make sure that I am representing Christ well as a clergy. So with all that understood, when it comes to the priesthood of all believers, so St. Peter talks about it in his epistle, that we are a royal priesthood and all that sort of stuff. What we don't seem to understand is that's actually taken, what some people don't seem to understand is that that's actually taken from the Old Testament. The Old Testament indicates that the people of Israel, I think it's in Leviticus, I can't remember the exact passage, but the people of Israel are called a royal priesthood, a nation of priests. And why that is important is this. Even with the priesthood of all believers in the Old Testament, there was still the Levitical priesthood. There was a separate group dedicated as clergy. So you can have the idea of there being a priesthood of all believers coinciding with the idea that there's a group dedicated as priests, as clergy. And so it's not an either or. It's
Yeah, exactly. I also think that one of the strong arguments in helping to dissolve this apparent tension that is especially common among many Protestants of a more low church background is to look at the Old Testament itself, because no one would deny that there is a special ministry installed by God himself in the Old Testament, namely the Levitical priesthood. And it is true that Christ, in a certain sense, has superseded the sacrificial nature of the priesthood in a very particular sense, namely for the offering of sin. Christ now is our high
Hebrews,
priest. Yes, exactly. But remember that the Old Testament priesthood wasn't only confined to the high priesthood. We also had the Levites serving as priests, and then the whole clan of Levites. And likewise, in the New Testament, we have our one high priest, namely our Lord Christ himself. But then likewise, he has personally, by divine institution, also installed a certain holy ministry to serve in the church. I think one of the more beautiful biblical verses is in 1 Corinthians, when Paul talks about this wonderful salvific work of God, where he bore over with the sins of the world. And then in the end, Paul makes this strong appeal, almost exhortation to the Corinthians, saying, then this is how you should see us, as the stewards of the mysteries of God. And this note about being the stewards of the mysteries of God fits so well with this, with the text in the pastoral epistles, talking about how an overseer, how an ordained member of the clergy must be able to oversee his own household. Because if he's not able to do that, then how will he be able to oversee the household of God? So this notion about stewarding or overseeing runs throughout both the New and the Old Testament. And as you said, it is not as if the Old Testament was super clerical, having a set apart ministry, and then the laity was just nothing. Because as you mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 7, God says to the whole nation of Israel, that is the whole people of God, you are a holy people. You are a nation of priests. So this concept of the universal priesthood is found both within Old and New Testament, well, pretty much because there's one people of God throughout salvific history. But then also, this does not in any way take away from the special ministry, from the ordained ministry. Those two things run in parallel, almost as like two tracks in a railway, where you need both of them to have the train running, that is the church running. So I think it's very good that you grab onto those things from the Old Testament, because they are really key in understanding this discussion.
Yeah, and I think one thing to add to this is that there is a legitimate concern about clericalism within the sort of more hierarchical form of the church. Like one of the biggest things I've noticed from being Baptist to becoming Anglican is that when it comes to the laity tend to be much more involved in a sort of low, I don't even want to say low church, but sort of in a Baptist or congregational, I should say, setting. And the laity are not so much as necessarily involved in ministry. Now, this is not always the case, but it's sort of in my experience, a limited experience, is that there is that concern that because we have a sort of hierarchical structure, therefore, a laity are not as involved or feel like they don't need to be involved as much. It's sort of like, well, I give you my check and you do all the other stuff, kind of thing. I think that's something we need to fight against, because I'm not the only one who's called to spread the gospel. We all are called to spread the gospel. We're all called to actually be training our own children as well.
Yes.
The education of the faith begins at the home, and that's actually one of the issues that we have today, where this is actually something I think across the entire church in the Western world, is that parents are not have sort of lessened the importance of actually training about the faith at home, when that's actually historically been the job of the parents to actually teach the faith, and the church is sort of supposed to supplement that, but not supposed to just completely do it.
Yes. Yeah, that is quite important, because I think, at least in my view, I think, for example, the Tridentine Mass, even though it has a certain aesthetic appeal, really stands as like the pinnacle of how not to do church. You have it.
Yes.
You have it in a foreign language which you aren't able to understand unless you're giving like a book. So you have to read along the Latin with your vernacular translation to follow along, which really takes away, or at least adds a filter between you and the service taking place. Then there's almost no participation by the laity. Even even in most places, at least, this is not universal though, but in most places, even the scriptural readings are done in Latin and not in the vernacular. And that just like flies against even the ancient church practice. I mean, why do people think we have like a Coptic liturgy, a Latin liturgy, a Greek liturgy, an Armenian liturgy, an Old Slavonic liturgy? I mean, because people translated it. This is done for the people. And I really think it's kind of a question of direction. So are we trying to do a lot of stuff for God? So it isn't really about the laity. The laity can just take the back seat, and the priest is really doing like all he can to offer this great sacrifice for God. Or is the direction of the service upward to down, because God is serving us? I think that's why one of the reasons why the expression, well, maybe it's a more Lutheran expression, but the term divine service or gottesdienst, gudstjeneste in Danish, is so beautiful because it can both mean the service of God, but it can also mean God's service of us, because it is
Yeah.
God who is coming to us in word and sacrament to help us and serve us. And then you can kind of have this divine conversation where God speaks to us, communicates his gifts to us, and we respond back with praise, with songs, with holy sacrifices. And then you can have a real active participation of the whole laity because this response is needed to God. I think that that dynamic adds a beautiful dimension. At least it is at least more dynamic than the Tridentine Mass in many respects, at least coming from the eyes of a Protestant.
Yeah, no. So my first sort of significant interaction with liturgy was through the Eastern Orthodox. The Antiochian Orthodox specifically use the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. And I started experiencing other liturgies after that, the Novus Ordo and Lutheran and such. And like the more Protestant the liturgy became, the more I appreciated it as someone who's searching for like a new tradition to be a part of. And it sort of culminated in the liturgy of the 1928 Book of Prayer, where I'm seeing there is this active participation of members of laity who are in the service, responding to the priest more and being involved as well, praying along the prayers as well, all that sort of stuff. And I was just very impressed with that, where I didn't see that so much in the sort of more, in the Eastern Orthodox liturgies, and especially in like the TLM, the traditional Latins. Now, granted, I was already an Anglican when I first encountered my first TLM, but like I was just very much not impressed with the TLM. Like it was physically beautiful, but I was like, if we want to talk about clericalism, the TLM is about as clerical as you can get, as clericalist as you can get.
Yes. You almost get the feel that you're a spectator watching what is going on and what is done by the priest, rather than you yourself actually being part of that holy service going on. And I think that is quite problematic. Well, then also another thing where I think to turn our view back onto the Protestant side of the aisle, one place where I feel a strong bond of unity with, especially Anglicanism, and feel that at least Lutheranism, as expressed by our confessional documents, that is Lutheranism proper, because we also have some wild liberalism going on in the last century, but confessional Lutheranism and Anglicanism really have retained a lot of Catholicity in regard to the doctrine and the practice of the holy ministry. And here I'm thinking especially about the role and importance given to ordination. So when talking about, we've just discussed the holy ministry and how that relates to the laity, but then ordination, because I think there's a large tendency among many of our Protestant friends to view ordination as nothing more than just like a public affirmation of this is the guy who we are setting aside to help. But I really think that is to impoverish ordination, really, and it's so divergent from the historic Catholic view of ordination. So would you like to help us understand how ordination is viewed within the Anglican tradition?
Yeah, so ordination can only happen by the authority of a bishop within the Anglican tradition. And that is going to be separating Anglicanism from pretty much every other Protestant sect in the United States, or in North America, I should say, where the only ones who maintained that, at least here on this side, as far as the Protestant sects. So there's a range of reasons why one might hold to the understanding or importance of the episcopate and it's sort of either very helpful or necessary. So I'll start with my own personal position, and then I'm going to water it down to sort of more, I guess you could say, reform position on all this stuff. So I do hold to apostolic succession. I think that is an important aspect. I don't think you're not in the church if you don't have apostolic succession, because our succession or our external sign of being in the church is baptism, not apostolic succession. That's just for the hierarchical part. So you're in the church by your baptism. If you don't have valid apostolic succession, that's not saying you're in the church. You still are in the church. But what my thoughts are these. We see the tradition, whether or not we can argue about the first century or so, in second century, but definitely by the end of the second century and third, and especially in the fourth, we see the solidifying of the understanding that bishops are the ones who ordain, and they ordain priests and deacons, and that the holy orders are a threefold ministry. It is bishops, priests, and deacons. So generally, the idea is that the bishops are the ones who consecrate and ordain, whether it's another bishop or priest or deacon. They also confirm, and now there's a tradition split there too, where priests can chrismate in the Eastern tradition, which is essentially a confirmation. Well, actually, it's been happening in the West now too with the Roman Catholics. I've read the Roman Catholics do that too. And Anglicans are basically the only ones who still require the bishop to confirm. But then you've got the priests who also consecrate the Eucharist. Now, everything that a priest can do, a bishop can do as well, and everything that a deacon can do, a priest and a bishop can do. So it's sort of a folding onto it. But then you've got the primary function of the priest is word of sacrament in the local parish, and they have the authority to consecrate the Eucharist. And then deacons can do things like preach, perform marriages, and baptize. And of course, any baptized person. So we're seeing these sorts of authorities, and they're sort of solidifying by the 4th, 5th, 6th century. Now, if we want, whether or not we want to say that the threefold ministry and the episcopate go back to the apostles, that's up for debate. I'm not going to demand that like one holds that it's apostolic in necessarily nature. Regardless of that, though, the fact remains that sort of by the authority of the church, it has been established to where the bishops are the only ones out of the threefold ministry who have the authority to ordain and consecrate other clergy. So now, fast forward to the Reformation. You have within the Anglican tradition the insistence upon keeping bishops as part of it. Now, some people argue, oh, it's only for good order. It's not like you're not part of the church. And again, I would agree with them on that part, although I would say it's part of what's known as the plenty essay. But we can get into that later. But my point being that they are seeking as much as possible to have continuity with what's been received. And so liturgically and canonically and all that, like the bishops have been the only ones who have ever been have had the power or the authority to ordain other men into the ministry. And so what we're saying is, well, we don't want to change that. Now, if we want to change that, we can change our canons, we could change our liturgy to where, say presbyters or priests can do that or something like that. But we didn't. We decided not to do that. And then so one could make an argument there where there's that changing of it. But what we've wanted to do is maintain continuity as much as possible. And so the break that we see is with, say, Presbyterians or Reformed Baptists and others like that. And especially the Methodists. I think the Methodists are the clearest example. Where there's this idea of, well, we're not going to go through the proper channels. We're just going to basically say, well, no, presbyters can actually ordain. And so therefore we're going to have them ordained. So then you see John Wesley doing that, which is eventually starts the Methodist Church, even though he didn't want to start a new church. You see the Presbyterians doing that basically, although they tend to be a bit more uniform in their sort of their way of working all that out. And so for me as an Anglican, I'm saying, well, I cannot recognize the authority because no one ever gets to just say, well, I'm going to take this authority on myself. I'm a priest. If I have even, let's say, legitimate issues with my bishop, and let's say there are like 5 of us priests under this bishop. Let's say, now my bishop is great. I love him. He's a wonderful man of God. So don't take it as me sort of hinting or indicating otherwise. But let's say he had some heresy. And like we 5 decide, okay, we're just going to start our own churches and all that sort of stuff, and we're going to start ordaining proper men and all that sort of stuff. Well, we're taking on that authority of our own, and we don't have we are not given that permission to do so. We've not been given the authority to, so we don't get to give that authority or give that gift of ordination. So regardless of the legitimacy of sort of issues with our authorities above us, we don't then therefore get to say, well, we're going to therefore just take that authority on ourselves. And as far as I know, for instance, like Luther himself didn't ordain anybody. He was still a priest. He died as a priest. He never, as far as I understand, like dreamed of himself ordaining people. Now, I might be wrong, but I've never heard of otherwise. Does that make sense, or do I need to clarify it more? I can't hear you now. I can't hear you.
Oh, yeah, sorry, my mic was muted. Is it better now?
Yes.
Yes, okay, excellent. Yeah, so I think it would be helpful maybe to sort out some of the implications here, because, so for example, I think comparing it with, let's say, lay baptism, having, for example, lay people going around baptizing. Now, that would be illicit unless it was under extreme dire circumstances, like I couldn't go around in my congregation usurping the pastor's role as the baptizer. That would be illicit of me. I do not have that authority. I should not do that. But could I? Well, could not in the moral sense. I should just stop it. But could in the metaphysical sense, that is to say, is it valid? Is it a real baptism I'm conferring on these infants? Well, yes, it would be a real baptism. It would just be an illicit baptism. That is, it's forbidden. I shouldn't do it. But had I done it, the child would have been baptized. So I think that is also important because to begin with what we agree upon, this is a copy of the Danish church order for the Lutheran Church. And you can also, if you go up on the article about Episcopal ordination, then not even Episcopal, sorry. If you go to the article about ordination, also of presbyters, that is priests, then only the bishop alone can ordain new clergy, and it has always been like that, at least in all the Nordic churches, and also in almost all of the, well, also all of the Lutheran churches, except they had within the office of bishop. They tended to install in the bishop fewer authorities and less jurisdiction, less power than in the Scandinavian churches, where the old Episcopal system were pretty much just carried on as prior to the Reformation. But there is one big difference, because all Lutherans would affirm that priestly ordination is valid. That is to say, if a priest ordains someone else, he is validly ordained. Now, it might be illicit, or it might be licit depending on the church order. So, for example, in Denmark, it would be illegal and illicit for any pastor to ordain anyone else. Only the bishop can do that. But as with the example of lay baptism, it would be viewed as a valid ordination. What would you make a hard line and say, well, it is only the bishop who has the faculties to ordain. So if a priest tries to ordain someone, he simply is not ordained. As if, for example, so how would you view that?
Yeah, so this is a very important point to make sure that we distinguish. So licitness versus validity. And I would agree with you about that distinction being within versus. I think we would agree on baptism, for instance, on where it's valid for a layman to baptize a baby, emergency baptisms and all sorts of stuff. It's not necessarily licit. Just sort of like, oh well, I want to baptize my newborn baby in the bathtub with my family and all that, so we're just going to do it here. Like that's not licit. But that doesn't mean a baptism did not happen. For Anglicans, now again, I'm going from a very strong understanding, an ontological understanding of apostolic succession, that as a priest I am marked with an indelible mark, and ontological changes happen that he is that's being ordained, sort of stuff. And we can get into that if you want. But I don't think you even need to necessarily hold to that. My point being that within our tradition, only bishops are allowed to ordain. There is no liturgy for priests to ordain. There's no exception within the ordination where it's like a bishop or a group of priests if a bishop not be present or something like that. There's no exception for that, and it's really interesting because a lot of my more low church Anglican friends try to act like we're okay with a sort of Presbyterian form of government. There's or not that we're personally okay with it as much as like we could work into being that kind of sort of thing. And like if you look at Anglican history, especially even after the Reformation, that's just not the case. So when Bloody Mary finally died and Queen Elizabeth took the throne, and we became Anglican again, we scoured the land trying to find an archbishop or a man to be consecrated as archbishop who was on the side of the Reformation, and that man was Matthew Parker. And we tried to find bishops who would be willing to consecrate him as the next archbishop, and because all the other ones were either killed or ran out of town and all this sort of during the Roman during Bloody Mary. And we ended up finally, after scouring the land, finding 4 men who were bishops who were willing to lay hands on him and consecrate Matthew Parker. And so we did that. We could have just been like, oh well, the Queen just says he's ordained now, so he's ordained. But we didn't do something like that. Same thing happens in the Episcopal Church here when after the Revolution, the American Revolution. Samuel Seabury and others are talking about, okay, well, we don't have bishops of our own. Are we going to just become Presbyterian now? Like, no, we're not going to become Presbyterian. We want to maintain the centrality of the episcopacy. So Samuel Seabury goes boats over to England, tries to get consecrated as a bishop. They were going to be okay with it, but then there was a problem because he would have had to swear an oath to the king and all that, and it's like, we just said, we're not going to do that. So then the Scottish then consecrate him instead, and then we get 3 others who get consecrated in England about a year or 2 later, something like that, and then we finally have our own bishops. Like there's this tenacity that we hold to the importance of the episcopacy, where even in sort of like the most dire of straits, we still maintain and try to continue the episcopacy. So we don't see ordinations done by presbyters / priests to be valid. That's not to say that we're going to say there's nothing beneficial or good out of it. It's just that this is not what we've received as our tradition, and we're not going to change it unless Scripture tells us we.
Okay, yeah. So maybe to put my own position a bit on the line, because so to say something a bit controversial, maybe I would say, for example, that ordination is a sacrament. It says so explicitly in the Lutheran confessions. Here we also, I think, need to do a bit justice in helping to at least differentiate between sacraments in the narrow sense, that is, a divinely instituted order for the forgiveness of sins. Now, naturally, ordination is not that, but it is a divinely instituted rite for the conferral of grace. And if we are to understand ordination, if we are to understand the term sacrament in a more broad sense, then definitely ordination is a sacrament, because it is in ordination itself that the ministry is entrusted to the candidate. Martin Chemnitz in his Enchiridion also uses the terminology of the ministry being commended to the person in ordination itself, because, so for example, the ministry at a minimum possesses the powers of the keys, that is, the power to bind and loose. Lay people can't do that. Lay people cannot excommunicate anyone, even if they wanted, even if they said it, it would be invalid. Nothing would have happened. It would only be something, it would be empty words having no power. But an ordained pastor, he can do it. There is something that really happens when he says that. So there is a difference between the ordained clergy and the laity then, at least in the possession of the power of the keys. Now, I would also go a step further. I would also say that when St. Paul in 1 Corinthians, I can't remember which chapter. Yeah, chapter 4. When St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 4 that you, that is the congregation in Corinth, you are to view us as the stewards of the mysteries of God, then the term mysteries of God is so often used to denote the mysteries, that is, the sacraments. The Latin word sacramentum just means something secret, and still to this day, it is the Greek term mysterion, which is used for sacraments in the Eastern tradition. So if the ordained clergy are the ministers of the sacraments, then I don't think that lay people can go around administering sacraments. That is to say, baptism is very special because baptism is the sacrament for entrance to the church. So I believe that all people can baptize, also because that is kind of the entrance sacrament. But then the other sacraments, let's say absolution, the Eucharist, ordination, and so on, I would say that only ordained clergy can confer the sacraments. That is to say, if I, as a layperson, I'm a layperson, if I tried to consecrate the Eucharist in my house, nothing would happen. Nothing would happen because I am not a steward of the mysteries of God. But likewise, and this is where I think it might be a bit controversial, I would deny the validity of any, let's say, lay ordination. 2 lay people or 3 lay people could not ordain anyone to the ministry because they are not stewards. But, and this is moving forward to the question I would ask you, would a priest, a simple priest or a group of simple priests be able to ordain? I know I'm pressing you on this a bit, but I do think it might be helpful because some people have viewed this as an actual real difference between Anglicanism and Lutheranism, because I appreciate the historical context, how there has been such a strong and good, I believe, emphasis on the role and importance of the bishopric. Sadly, when Denmark went through the Reformation, we weren't able to bring over any of the old bishops. That also had to do with, I think we had 23 bishops prior to the Reformation. And out of those 23 bishops, only 2 of them were theologians who had any theological training. The rest were just members of the nobility. So we had a very horrible situation. But in the Kingdom of Sweden, next to us, they actually brought over some of the old Catholic bishops and had them ordain the new bishops, just as was done in the Anglican tradition. So they had continued let's say the classical way of conferring Episcopal ordination with apostolic succession, which we'll discuss later. But back to the question there, do you think that nothing happens when priests try to ordain to another man as a priest, or do you think it's just something which should be avoided at all costs? It is illicit, but it might be valid still.
So, in general, I'm going to say lean heavily towards no, but it's going to be a stronger or weaker no depending on the situation. So, if the bishops, say 500 years ago during the Reformation, within your context, canonically decided that and liturgically as well. It's not just a canonical question, but also the liturgy itself has changed and all that to allow for priests and giving them that authority uh, to the point where like priests who are given that authority have this authority to ordain themselves. I would still say I don't feel comfortable with that because it's not what we have received, but I would be more understanding of that position, I should say. However, if it's just sort of like, well, a priest, a bishop, they're just the same thing. It doesn't matter. So we're just going to have the priests do ordination as well. And sort of like after that decision is made later on, generations later or whatever, sort of the liturgy catches up with that and the canons catch up with that, I'm going to be having a much more difficult time accepting that sort of thing. But regardless of it for either way, let's say a bishop or let's just say a priest or a pastor within the Lutheran tradition becomes Anglican, we are most likely going to reordain that person, unless we can sort of track their apostolic succession and all that sort of stuff. That's not going to be the same case with a Roman Catholic or an Eastern Orthodox. We've had plenty of Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox come to the Canterbury Trail, and we don't reordain them or anything like that. We recognize their holy orders already. But all of that is not to say that nothing has happened during the ordination process with the laying on of hands and things like that. For me to not recognize it as a valid ordination is not the same as me saying it is an invalid ordination. And I'm not trying to play a word game. I'm trying to be very careful. And I'm very insistent upon this precisely because I do not want to make the same mistakes that Roman Catholics do and things like that, which is I'm going to say that God is not working where God is working. Where I'm very hesitant to say that there is no ordination or valid ordination. It's just invalid or anything like that. I'm going to say that I can't recognize it as a valid ordination. And we're going to do things there. That's not to say that God's grace is not working in that, and that it's just a different thing from what we receive. My issue is that we have not received that, so we're not going to change things unless we're convinced by Scripture to change it.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a very fair distinction, because it is one thing to say, like, here we have the proper amount of certainty that there's a valid ordination have taken place. Let's say, for example, if you, God willing, were to become a Lutheran pastor someday, we wouldn't reordain you, right? Because we are certain that you are validly and properly ordained. But for example, if some Presbyterian guy came in and became a Lutheran pastor, we might not have that certainty. So I do think it's a fair distinction to say, here we are certain, here we are uncertain. We are not saying that we are sure you are not ordained. We are not saying that. But we're just saying we can't have any certainty that you are ordained. So I think that's a very fair distinction and a good one to make. So I would like to send you, when the conversation is done, an article by a Lutheran church historian who's called Arthur Peepcorn. He was also an American.
Oh, I know.
Oh yeah, great. Do you know his article about he walks through late church history, not very early church history, but late church history about Presbyterian ordination?
Yeah, there are exceptions, and you see them even within the Middle Ages. And things like
right.
That. And it again goes to the question of canonical questions and all that sort of stuff. And for me, it again goes to imagine ordination as sort of like a knot. And if it's sort of done as an emergency situation, think of it as not necessarily a well-tied knot, but it's a knot nonetheless. Whereas for me, it's like, well, the idea of an ordination is done by the bishop, and so that's the well-tied knot. A consecration of a new bishop is, at least, I'm trying to remember if it's 3 or 4. I think actually 4 for us. 4 bishops have to consecrate a new bishop. Not that they have to where it's invalid otherwise, but it's like the tying of the knot being as secure as possible. So that's sort of what runs through my mind. So you can have exceptions of a variety of things, and it goes to that question that we talked about earlier of licitness versus validity. But I don't want to use those sort of outsiders as sort of making it standard.
Yeah, just for the benefit of the viewers, maybe, because there's many, well, not many. It was not the norm that priests went about ordaining in medieval times. It was rare, but the interesting thing is that it actually did happen. So, for example, I'm quite glad he mentioned this this example. So, when Christianity first arrived in Denmark, it was brought here by Saint Ansgar, who was a Frankish priest, and he planted churches and preached the gospel. He was a very heroic man back then, when we were savage Vikings and engaged in all sorts of disgusting pagan worship. But he brought the light of the gospel to a very dark and cold corner of the world back then. But he also went around ordaining other men to the priesthood, even though he were only himself a priest. And then this is also mentioned by Robert Bellarmine, one of the great counter-reformers of the Roman Catholic tradition. He also tries to deal with this really a bit embarrassing problem, maybe, that throughout medieval times it had been the norm for abbots to ordain other men into the priesthood. An abbot is the chief monk of a monastery, but he is himself only ordained as a priest. He's not ordained as a bishop. Yet it was very common for these abbots, these arch monks, to ordain other monks into the priesthood. So there have always been these issues. Now, I think it's a very good point that we should always follow the canonical procedure. So, for example, in Denmark, we cannot go around doing Episcopal ordinations. Nothing. We can't do anything but Episcopal ordinations, because that is what the church order has historically maintained. But I do think it's interesting, and maybe this will be my final note, at least on the question of ordination, namely that if it is proper to the office of, let's say, the priesthood, that there is a divine investment of, let's say, the power and faculties to ordain, then even though we might, for good order, by canonical rules, say that only a bishop can do it, then I do think if it is something that God has installed in the holy office, then no canonical rules can take that faculty away. At least only for the usage of peace and tranquility in the church. Like we might have we might ordain somebody to the priesthood and say, you are only a youth minister. You will, let's say, serve as a kind of priest at a large university, and you'll minister to the young people who are there. It is not as if he could not validly confer absolution in a local parish, but it might be against the canonical order and his special service and ministry as a university priest. And then, like an analogy to that would be, we have forbidden priests to ordain, but since it is God himself who has invested that office with the faculty of ordination, then we must only think of this prohibition as a man-made one and not as an absolute metaphysical one.
Interesting. I would make a bit of a distinction there. So for us, at least, there's no sort of ordination of youth minister kind of thing. College. So I'm looking to the what the liturgy itself teaches when it comes to that. So we ordain. We have three ordination rites, which are the episcopate, the priesthood, and the diaconate. And those gifts are conferred within those liturgies themselves. So that would be sort of where I come to with it.
Yeah,
or maybe perhaps.
Yeah, no, I think I formulated myself badly. So this youth minister, he would be ordained as a priest because, as you said, there's no office of youth minister. So he would be an ordained priest, but he might be installed for a very specific ministry, like we might have an army chaplain, for example. So we can, in the Anglican rite, we can ordain a priest. He is a real priest. but we are telling him you must follow, for example, the British Army, and you must serve those alone. Like if he ran away from his battalion and put up like a service in the local village, it would all be valid, but it might be illicit because he's going against that special calling he's been entrusted with.
I see. Okay. No, definitely, I would agree. Like, it would, if I were to just sort of start a parish without letting my bishop know, and just being like, okay, I'm going to do my stuff. Although we're really big on church growth, so maybe, well, not so much in the REC. I mean, the REC is big on church growth, but in the ACNA, there tends to be, depending on the bishop, it's going to be a bit loose on something. But like, I need to inform my bishop if I'm going to start a new parish, you know.
Yes.
And so, like, if I didn't inform my bishop about that, just like I'm going to start this church and everything. Well, I mean, sure, the sacraments I'm administering are valid and all that sort of stuff, but I'm not being canonically faithful to my bishop. So yeah, I would agree with that.
Yes. Okay, yeah, that's great. So moving on to the question of apostolic succession, that is also one of these hotly disputed issues, especially when we are trying to converse and dialogue with our Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox friends. Then that is really a central issue coming up. So would you like to, I know you sometimes when you present apostolic succession, it can be quite helpful to go through like the different understandings of apostolic succession, because sometimes people denote rather different things by that term. So would you like to help the viewers understand what we actually mean by apostolic succession?
So yeah, and again, this goes to the question of sort of like my very strong sense of it, which is an ontological sense, which is not necessary to hold to, but makes most sense. But you can go to even a sort of more just Reformed Catholic understanding, which is that, again, the church, God has given the church the authority to sort of how we structure ourselves. And so historically, that authority has been imbued most fully within the bishop. And so a bishop can only be consecrated by other bishops. And so if you just recognize that a bishop cannot be made a bishop by a bunch of laity, and that he needs to be made a bishop by the bishop before him, then you're basically holding to apostolic succession. It's like, because you have to go backwards, which with each generation of bishops, and it's got to be bishops all the way back up to then the apostles. And again, we can talk about like in the early church whether or not there was a sort of melding of or whether sort of episcopate and presbyterate were sort of interchangeable. We can get into those sorts of discussions, but more or less the idea is that by the time all that sort of hardens into the episcopate, we're just holding to the idea that a bishop has to be ordained by or consecrated by a bishop, who's got to be consecrated by a bishop, who's got to be consecrated by a bishop all the way back. And so whether or not you believe in sort of the ontological marking of those who are clergy, and I would say those who are confirmed as well, and those who are baptized, whether or not you believe in that ontological marking, the fact remains that if you hold to the idea that just like Bob, Smith, the layman, can't just be like, well, I want that person to be the bishop, so we're going to make him the bishop, and like he just decides for that, and like the nation or whatever. Well, then you have to hold to some form of apostolic succession. Like that's it. Now, I can talk about the Roman and Anglican dialogue about that because they deny our apostolic succession. But did you want me to pause there before we get to that?
Yeah, maybe I would just add that so I think so one of the difference here is that and we haven't really maybe brought that out into the light yet, but so at least coming from the other side of the English Channel, coming from Wittenberg, we would see, I suppose, the office of bishop and presbyter being a gradation within the same ministry. That is to say, when we are ordaining, there is only one holy ministry instituted in the church, and in that holy ministry, the stewardship of the sacraments is entrusted to the candidate. Now, as the church has grown, we have gradated that office for very good reasons. But I do think maybe we can get into it. Maybe it would be too much off topic. But I do think we also see this clearly in the ancient church, where there just is no sharp hardline distinction between a priest and bishop. Well, maybe there was, for example, my personal take on it is that we actually always had priests and bishops, but that the bishop was just the archpriest of a congregation. So, for example, it really seems like in the ancient church there were multiple priests in these old large congregations, but then one of those priests would be the bishop who committed oversight over the whole congregation and who presided over the Eucharist and who did the preaching. And then he would have lesser priests serving under him. And for example, it might very well have been the case that they would not be the ones presiding over the Eucharist. They would not be the ones doing absolution, for example. So already here we see it's the same office. The terms are more or less synonymous, but by man-made, but for good order in the church, we have differentiated these grades. Also, the bishops back in the ancient church used to be very small. So, for example, North Africa at the time of Cyprian had something like 300 bishops, even though barely anyone lived there, right? And then like England today with 40 million people, and I mean, this is naturally the Church of England, but maybe there's like 20 or 30 bishops to 40 million people or something. I mean, so these offices go through some development. But going back to the question, I would affirm the necessity of apostolic succession in the sense that, as I explained before, I believe only ordained men, validly ordained men alone can ordain others. And that means you must necessarily have that chain going back all the way to the apostles. Now, one difference here might be that I do not restrict that to the succession of bishop to bishop. I would be fine with a succession of somebody who is validly ordained. So, for example, when, as I mentioned earlier, when Christianity was brought to Denmark, we did not have clergy with apostolic succession in the Episcopal sense, but we did have it in the presbyterate sense. That is, St. Ansgar, he was himself ordained by a bishop who had been ordained by a bishop all of the way back to the apostles. But when he conferred ordination on these candidates, then I would view them as having valid apostolic succession. But that is a usage of the word which is not, which might be a bit improper, because normally when apostolic succession is discussed, we try to denote only the succession from bishop to bishop. But that really comes down to this question: are the bishopric and the presbyterate grades of the same sacramental office, or are they two dissimilar and disjointed offices?
Yeah, so I would say it's the threefold office, that it's diaconate and presbyterate, and that's an unfolding of them when they're receiving more authority. That being said, though, I don't think so. If I could ask for a clarification, you would say that if that a deacon could make a bishop, right? Could ordain, consecrate a man to be a bishop, right?
So here we would have to distinguish, because sometimes we can talk about lay deacons, for example. We can ordain.
Well, I'm talking about ordained deacons.
So we would say if you ordain a deacon, then like in the rite of ordination, then he is a priest, but we are just restricting his services to, let's say, some like like a sub priest or something. So if you validly ordain a deacon, he is a priest. He could confer the Eucharist. He could do absolution. But we have so designated his office that he has. He doesn't serve the full office of priest. He only has like a subset. Then you might have a lay deacon. But so the question really is, can a priest ordain a bishop? And here I would say yes. A group of priests could ordain a bishop. And that is to say, that is because, in my view at least, and in the Lutheran view, a bishop is a sort of archpriest. He is a leader in the same sacramental office as his brethren. So, for example, when we hear about how it was the custom in Alexandria for the presbyters to come together and designate one from their midst as the bishop, then I think that kind of encapsulates this more Lutheran view, where there is a stronger sense of equality in a certain sense. Like, for example, I think Peter is a proto-bishop among his priestly apostolic friends. That is to say, like, all the apostles were equal in their apostolate. They all had the same sacramental office. But there is no doubt that Peter had a higher role, that he had a leadership in a certain sense. And we would see that as an analogous to priests and bishops.
Yeah, so with that, let me think. When I look at the patristic evidence, I see sort of two categories, I guess you could say. One category is I see evidence that's not conclusive, but that is helpful, like leans towards the idea that the episcopate and presbyterate are sort of more or less interchangeable, right? So there is evidence for that. I'm not going to deny it. If you read Clement of Rome, St. Clement of Rome, and if you read, Eusebius talks about it as well. And there can be some indications about that within the scriptures as well. However, then the other evidence, I would say, is very decisively on the monarchical. That's obviously the Ignatian epistle. So St. Ignatius of Antioch, who's writing in AD 107. And he's very insistent upon the monoepiscopal. So for me, I'm looking at this, and the way I sort of reconcile it all is this. During the first generation of Christians, have the apostles, then you have the presbyters and the overseers, who are the bishops, who are sort of more or less seen as the same thing, but with the overseer as possibly sort of an archpriest, and then you have the diaconate after that. And when the apostles are sort of moved away, they die out and stuff, then you've got the overseers who eventually fill in that spot of the apostle, who are not, obviously, I'm not saying that they have the same authority or whatever, but like you understand the point, that they're sort of filling in that spot, because what we see is St. Paul basically being a bishop, going from church to church. He's got a variety of churches under his authority. He's telling them what to do. He's ordaining men and all that sort of stuff. And so what I think is happening is there might be, I guess, a bit of confusion with some of the churches in the early sort of century or so, right after the first generation. And so you see them sort of having a bit of a presbyterate sort of form or whatever, but then it just sort of solidifies into, well, hey, the apostles did it this way, maybe we should copy that too. So some people had already been doing that, which would be St. Ignatius and those other churches that he's writing to, for instance. And then other people are just sort of like that by the end of the second century, sort of catching up. Okay, well, we do need to do it this way. And again, the question for me is not so much, not necessarily validity, as we've talked about before, as much as I don't want to change something unless I'm convinced that Scripture demands I change it. And so and I think the church needs to be uniform on a variety of issues, on as many issues as possible. That Scripture doesn't. So, like, for instance, liturgy would be something different, where it's like, okay, well, we don't need to have all the exact same liturgy, because Scripture itself doesn't indicate that. But I think when it comes to sort of the way that the church functions, as far as the hierarchy is concerned, I think we have to have a lot of overlap. So the basic structure, the threefold ministry, the episcopate, the presbyterate, and the diaconate, I think that should be maintained as much as possible, as uniform as possible.
Yeah, I perfectly agree. So talking about practicality, I do believe, and I would be insistent on the usefulness and the importance of retaining the episcopal structure of the church, because that is simply the historic form, and as you said, that is also the received form of church governance. And it is one of those few marks of the church which are universal. I mean, it shouldn't be
Yeah.
something which divides us. And we also see that, I mean, in the small court articles and in the apology of the Augsburg Confession, two of the Lutheran confessional books, that we state explicitly that we do not wish to remove the office of bishop. We do not wish to overturn the church order. So, especially, and we also see that in practicality, that was how it was done in Europe. We retained the bishopric, even though they, especially in Germany, especially because they in Germany just try to move away from the term bishop and use the term superintendent, which is, funnily enough, the term that, for example, that Jerome used for the bishops in Latin. But putting that aside, and that has to do with some of the legality of the term bishop within the Holy Roman Empire and the whole legal code and all that. So putting all that aside, I think the reason why we Lutherans have a tendency to discuss the validity of these office distinctions so much is because there is, for us at least, a lot at play, because we have used presbyteral ordination for so long, and we would want to protect the certainty of the means of grace committed and used by these ordained members of the clergy. So I think that is the insistence. And I mean, that discussion, granted, is just not as relevant when you have just kept the old system where doubt is not present. So I think that's fine, really. But I do want to ask you a question about Ignatius, because would you I don't know if you've thought about this, so it's fine if you don't have an answer just off the cuff, but when I'm reading Ignatius as well, it's very clear that he is so insistent on the office of bishop, and that is an office distinct from presbyter. We can agree on that. But what I would say is that, for me, it really seems like by bishop he means nothing else than archpriest in a congregation. So, for example, when he says that where the bishop is, there is the church. That is the ecclesia, the congregation, and where the bishop is, there's the Eucharist. I mean, it really seems as if Ignatius doesn't view the bishop as a kind of like a diocesan bishop or a chairman of many different congregations. For me, it really seems like he just imagines that the bishop is like the centrality and the point of gravity within the local congregation. And I think that reading fits really well with the explanation I gave earlier about the office of bishop growing out of the archpriest, that is the leading priest of these large congregations in the ancient church.
Yeah, so with that, I don't. That is a possibility. For me, though, at the end of the day, I don't see how that would be, I guess, an argument against my position, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
I would, when I think of sort of like the church in Rome, for instance, I'm not thinking of, well, 55 parishes under this one bishop who is, on 5th Street, and he's got to visit, you do the diocesan visit every year and all this sort of stuff, and visit every parish once every Sunday or whatever. Like, I'm not thinking that, because like we're talking about a very small group of people, maybe 50 people or something like that, maybe more, but the sort of the bishop probably only having one building where they all gather together, one house, right? Maybe a few households, maybe it gets bigger and all this sort of stuff. But yes, you do see for Saint Ignatius this sort of idea that the Eucharist is valid only insofar as it is connected to the bishop himself. which I would actually agree with. The only reason I have the authority to consecrate the Eucharist is that I am under a bishop who has given me sort of that authority. And so my authority to do so is derivative of that. To the point where, suppose I didn't have a bishop that I was under, suppose I was defunct. I am not convinced that as a priest, I could, as a defrocked priest, I would still be a priest, but I wouldn't have the authority to, or the Eucharist that I would try to consecrate, not valid. I'm not convinced. I have to think it over a bit more. But I tend to agree with Saint Ignatius that my consecrating of the Eucharist is derived from the authority that I have with the bishop himself.
Yeah, interesting, because in Ignatius, I see this kind of, at least this is how I want to harmonize Ignatius with the rest of the patristic data, because Ignatius really is far out there. I mean, because we can view, let's say, the Shepherd of Hermas, First Clement, the Didache, where the laity needs to call the men into the office of holy bishops, or the liturgy of, yeah?
Yeah, if I could actually talk to that, because I forgot to talk about that. So very quickly, we do need to make a distinction between sort of the calling and the ordination. I do think it is the job of the laity to call people to.
Okay, great. Yeah. Yeah, and that is.
I would. Yeah, it's something that the church has to like the laity themselves. They have to be like, no, we see the gift of God in you for ordination, need to be ordained. But that's not the same as saying, therefore, he's.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that is so important. I mean, Lutheranism, when we talk about installation into the holy office, ordination, all this stuff, I mean, the theology of the call in Lutheranism is so big. I mean, it's like it's the thing we'd like to talk the most about, because also, as we began our conversation, we talked about the dangers of clericalism. I mean, that is why, and one of the chief places where a heavy emphasis on the importance and necessity even of the holy call is so important, because the laity really needs to call out the minister, because that is the instrument through which God gives his call. And we see all throughout the books of the prophets in Isaiah and Jeremiah that false prophets, even though they can do prophecies and miracles and so on, then they are false prophets because they lack the divine calling, even though their miracles might be true. So I believe that is really also important, and it's nice that you give us a chance to discuss it. And it's also quite interesting, very patristic, because we have throughout the ancient liturgies, the congregation needs to reply to the ordination with Axios, Axios, he is worthy, he is worthy. And we have this also in the Didache, that the laity needs to call the minister. So it's really nice that we also got a chance to bring that up, because that is also really important, that it's kind of, the church is constituted by the two elements of the clergy and the laity. So the laity gives the call, the clergy tests the candidate and ordains him. And in that manner, we have a perfect cooperation between the whole church. The laity is involved in their proper place, and the clergy is involved in their proper place. And I think, especially with, let's say, the Roman Catholic tradition, here we only have the clergy doing the whole process of the installation of a new candidate to the holy ministry. And that is wrong, because you cut off the other half of the church. And then in, let's say, more low church Protestant groups like Baptist and so on, it's pretty much only the laity. I mean, it's only the laity calling and testing and ordaining, and it's not as if they think the clergy has a right to, for example, reject a candidate or something. So I do think these two errors have to avoid it. It has to be the whole church coming together.
Well, what's interesting and very sad, at least here in the United States, is that like your average non-denom church, they like sort of it started by some guy who's like, well, I think I want to start a church. He's not sent by his own church, and he's not ordained. He just was like, well, I'm gonna just do it, and that ends up being sort of the model where the church is treated almost like a business, and if anything, that's a bit more clericalist than anything else. Maybe not clerical, but just the idea, like the audacity of just being like, well, I'm going to start a church, and I'm not going to seek wisdom and authority, permission or anything like that. Like it seems a very odd
Right,
system.
yeah. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, so maybe the last thing here on Saint Ignatius, just to finish that point, because I do really think this is interesting. Um, before this important digression on the importance of the holy calling, but so the way I try to harmonize, or at least fit in Ignatius with all these other very early patristic sources, is to, because if we make Ignatius' view of the episcopate too high, I really think we are cutting him out of his context and ending up calling Ignatius an innovator, which is something I don't think we want to do, because we want to see Ignatius as a faithful steward of the traditions having been received and entrusted to him, and he's only handing on what he received. I don't think he was a great innovator. And because every time he mentions the importance and the office of bishop, it really seems to be on a congregational level. And as you said, I don't think this is an argument against your position. I really don't, because we both grant that the offices have gone through some development. So we might have an office of bishop having in the beginning only been, let's say, about one congregation, and then it evolved maybe to having a headship of multiple congregation, and later on in the centuries later, we have bishoprics stretching
The
over.
diocesan model and all that.
Yeah, and then the bishopric also evolves, because we kind of get like archbishops, right? Just as we had archbishops, and we get metropolitans and patriarchs, and it just continues to grow as the church expands. But I also think this is just as it is not an argument against your position, then likewise I do think it's also an affirmation of the Lutheran position, in the sense that it shows that if we grant that the bishop is nothing but an archpriest, then just like, for example, in the large Danish towns of the 16th century, you would have multiple priests within a congregation, because you might have a cathedral with, I don't know, 8,000 parishioners, like 8,000 people living there. And no single priest could serve that many people. So you would have maybe 5 priests in a single church, but they would then choose an archpriest among them who would supervise and have the responsibility over the other priests. I would say that is very much akin to the ancient bishop. And if that is true, then it does really seem that it is the same sacramental office, really, especially when we combine that with the clear witnesses to presbyterate ordination, because I would imagine that it would only be this sort of archpriest or early congregational bishop who would ordain, because he's the natural leader. So naturally, he would be the one ordaining new candidates.
Yeah, so a few thoughts on that. It goes to the insistency of Saint Ignatius that the bishop is something that is distinct from the presbyter and the deacon, right? So for me, it's a stronger thing than just sort of like, well, you need a leader, so having one guy at the top is good. So pick one of the presbyters to be sort of overseer. It's a stronger argument, I think, for that. I think I'm not going to like say necessarily that he's thinking ontologically, but I'm just going to use that for sake of clarity, I guess. Is that I think that there is an ontological difference. It's sort of more or less in his argumentation, or something equivalent, to where the bishop is something that is different from the presbyter and the deacon. And so for me, it's not the same as sort of like, well, we've got about 5 or 6 priests here serving this, equivalent of a mega church or whatever. So one of them kind of needs to be in charge. I don't think it's quite that. However, that being said, what is interesting is that Presbyterians in the United States here, with their presbyteries and all that, they end up more or less having an Episcopal system where one presbyter ends up being the guy who's kind of in charge. And it is interesting how it always works that way. And like the same thing with megachurches, where you've got like, well, there's this one church that grows so quickly that they start getting other campus, purchasing other properties in different cities, and it's like, well, this is the experienced church in this town, but here's the experienced church in this other town, and it's connected, and like it ends up basically being a diocese because it's got like 5 or 6 different campuses, and it's all under this one pastor. What is interesting, my point being, is that regardless of sort of how we think it initially starts, it always gears towards an Episcopal system. And I think that's part of like the Holy Spirit just sort of nudging us, saying, and like nudging us towards that direction. So regardless of whether we think it goes all the way to the apostles, I think it is a good system because we tend to go towards that system.
That is true, and for all the practicality, we also in perfect agreement. I really believe the Nordic churches did right in retaining the Episcopal structure, and I do think that is important. So we would be totally on the same side of the aisle in that discussion. But yeah, I just do think the historical discussion is so important because. I mean, I grant that there is a sharp distinction in Ignatius between bishop, priest, and deacon. But I mean, we too would also grant that there is a strong distinction between patriarch, metropolitan, and bishop, right? Even though it's the same.
No, I wouldn't say.
Oh, really? No. Yeah. But I mean,
yeah.
It's very different if we have like the patriarch of Constantinople, and we have maybe like a metropolitan, like the bishop of Athens or something, and then like a local bishop. The office and the role of these 3 men will differ, but we would all agree that it's the same sacramental office. So likewise, I would see in Ignatius that even though he distinguished between priest and bishop, I would see it as the same office. And just like a last thing on that, because when he compares the offices, he says, obey your bishop as God. But then he says, and I think this is quite interesting, obey the presbyter as the apostles. So it really seems like in contradistinction to Roman Catholic ecclesiology, that in the mind of Ignatius, it's the presbyterate which are the successors of the apostles, because he compares the bishopric with God and then the presbyterate with the apostles.
I think that's taking his comparison of his sort of analogy a bit too far, I would say. I've heard that argument before. I'm not convinced of that because he's talking about obedience. He's not talking about and what's the one he does for deacon? Is it like Jesus or something?
I have the quotation here. So it's in his letter to the Magnesians, chapter 6, he says, "Be zealous to do all things in harmony with God, with the bishop presiding in the place of God, and the presbyters in the place of the council of the apostles, and the deacons, who are most dear to me, entrusted with the service of Jesus Christ, who was from all eternity with the Father and was made manifest at the end of time."
Yeah, I mean, that I don't think that analogy is working as far either way when it comes to sort of the apostolic succession. I don't think that's sort of what's in his mind at all about sort of like, well, the priests are actually the ones who are in apostolic succession. I don't think that works. But there was something you said before that I wanted to bring up and I forgot it. Shoot, I forgot it. And it was a very important point too. What were we talking about?
Yeah, I mentioned about the office of patriarch, metropolitan, and bishop.
Yeah. So what happens there is you do not see an ordination happen when a bishop is made to a metropolitan, to an archbishop, to a patriarch, etc. Rather, what you see is an installation.
Oh yeah.
So let's say I were made the archdeacon, which is it sounds weird, but like basically it is a priest who's sort of like a higher up within the diocese. Let's say I'm made an archdeacon, right? I don't get an ordination for that. I'm not ordained to be an archdeacon. Let's say I'm made. Let's say I am a bishop already. Let's say I'm made the archbishop. So when I was in the what's known as the Diocese of the South, ACNA, back in 2014, my bishop, who was Foley Beach at that time, he was made the archbishop. And what they had was they didn't have an ordination or a consecration for him. They had an installation of him as the archbishop. And that is seen as something that is not a sacramental ordination. It's not sacramental, at least in the ecclesiastical sense. You can talk about sort of the quote sacramentals in the sort of minor sense, but everything is a sacramental if you do that. So it's
Yes.
not one of the. And I do need to talk very quickly about sort of because we talked about this before, but I didn't get to. I forgot to put my 2 cents on. Within Anglicanism, there's a distinction between the dominical sacraments, which are baptism, the Eucharist, versus the other 5, or not versus, but and the other 5. The other 5 are what are known as ecclesiastical sacraments. These are things that the signs, the physical aspects of, are given to us by the church and not necessarily from Christ himself. So Christ does give us, for instance, the authority of absolution, but he doesn't give us the physical sign to it. So the church has the authority to sort of change that around. Same with the other 4 of the 5 ecclesiastical sacraments. So confirmation is not something that's given by Christ himself. We see it in the apostles, where the apostles lay on hands and all sorts of stuff. Same ordination. But back to the Metropolitan Archbishop.
No, yeah,
It's an installation.
Joe, just before you go on, I would have saved that to the question and answer session, but we actually had like a comment asking about that, so I think it's really great that you brought it up. Just to finish that question then, because I think now that we are at the topic, I also think it's very important to distinguish between what we might call ecclesiastical terms, that is, terms that are not well defined by scripture. If there's, so for example, absolution or the Eucharist, we have a very clear scriptural guidance for how that is. So we don't have the authority to change that too much. But the term sacrament isn't used in a kind of dogmatic and very clear, very equivocal way in scripture. So we can, that's why we Lutherans historically have wanted to talk about sacraments in the narrow sense and then in a more broad sense, because this is a sort of ecclesiastical term that is a term not well defined by scripture. So we will allow for certain different senses. And in that sense, I mean, it is difficult. So normally we differentiate between the sacraments conferring the forgiveness of sins, so absolution, the Eucharist, and baptism. That would be our 3 main sacraments. So in the narrow sense, we have 3 sacraments. But then, I mean, ordination is kind of odd because it is something by Dominic institution, that is Christ. He blew on the apostles, entrusted the Holy Spirit to them, and ordained them. So, but we don't ordain anyone by blowing on them. This is actually a point that Johann Gerhard, the Lutheran theologian, makes when discussing whether the laying on of hands is necessary for ordination, because strictly speaking, by Dominic institution, it is the blowing of the Spirit which is the sign of ordination. But then we see it's only Christ doing it in that manner, because in the later scriptures themselves, we see Paul and Timothy and so on committing ordination by the laying on of hands.
I would say the breathing on the apostles is sort of the confirmation of their fullness of the apostleship, where they receive the Holy Spirit directly from there. And I guess you could say it's fully culminated in the Pentecost.
Yeah, right. I would also see the office of apostle as a different office, not existing in the church anymore, because they could like entrust new revelation and so on, and priests and bishops can't do that. So there's a difference. But I do think it's a good question that Peter Williams made here. But I was so rude to interrupt you. You were going to say something about bishop, archbishop, and metropolitan before I came in.
Oh, no. I think I was finished. I was just reiterating what I was talking about.
Okay. Yeah. Well, great then. I do really think this has been a very helpful conversation. Maybe the last thing I will add before I will give you the last word, and then we can maybe go through some of the comments. And if people have questions, then write them in the comment section now. But the last thing I would say is that in a very strict sense, as a Lutheran, we would actually say that if you have a validly ordained priest who is then ordained as a bishop, then what do we mean by the term ordination? In a certain sense, this priest is just installed as a bishop. But that being said, he is also entrusted with some faculties by the church, namely, for example, with the jurisdiction over the priests, with power, not the power, he already has that, at least according to the Lutheran reading, but with the jurisdiction and the licity of ordination. Now he can actually licitly go about ordaining candidates. So in a certain sense, he is ordained. And if you read the ritual here, it does. I've been studying this question quite a bit because I do think it's, I hope to become a priest myself. So these questions about ordination, apostolic succession are questions I do find very important. And I must be honest, it does really seem like at least the Danish church constitution is closer to the Anglican understanding, because when comparing the ordination of priest with the ordination of bishop, it does seem like the ordination of a priest is a lesser, more condensed rite of ordination. And then in the ordination of a bishop, it's much fuller, and you have certain, for example, there's more going on there. So it does kind of seems like it leans a bit more in the Anglican Anglican ordination, or at least in the more high church Lutheran reading as well, because in the Church of Sweden, we really have a high view of the bishopric, and they also have a stronger tradition on account also of they having retained the traditional historic usage of apostolic succession. So it is quite interesting. But yeah, just to finish it off here before I go on too long, it is just to say that I do firmly believe that it is the same sacramental order, two grades, but that they do have different faculties in regards to what they can do and what they can do licitly. There might be some, and there's differences in Lutheranism, because we also have very low church Lutherans who have run off with a few ideas of Martin Luther and taken them wholly out of context, which is very unhelpful. But they need to read the rest of the confessions to see their errors. But regardless,
we have the same problem ourselves. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yes. So yeah, it is quite an interesting and important discussion. But thank you so much for coming on and giving some clarity. If you have any last comments, then you can make them, and then we will go to question and answers.
Yeah, I think it is important to talk a little bit about this. The arguments that Roman Catholics have made against holy orders within Anglicanism, how familiar are you with those?
Yeah, I am. I read the official reply of the Anglican bishops to Apostolic Kyrie. What?
Sapiens Officio.
Yeah, it was really good. Yeah, wonderful. Yeah.
So, there is a problem with like sort of the Roman understanding, which is that the priest is being made a sacerdotal sacerdotal just means priest, but the priest is becoming a sacrificing priest in the sense that the Eucharist itself is a propitiatory sacrifice. And as Anglicans, we would wholeheartedly reject the idea that the Eucharist itself is a propitiatory sacrifice apart from the sacrifice of Christ. And now they wouldn't necessarily tease it out that way, but essentially they have to, I would say. If you hold to the Eucharist as part of the one sacrifice, which is it is connected to, because it is the body and blood of Christ, by virtue of being that it is part of it is the sacrifice, then like the priest who is offering this Eucharist to the people to receive, you can talk about him being a priest in that sense. And so the point being that this is connected because they claim we don't have valid apostolic succession because of this, because we don't have valid priests, we don't have valid bishops, that we don't have the valid, we broke our whole sort of stuff. My point being is that that argument comes from a bad understanding of what the sacrifice of Christ on the cross is, and what the sacrifice of the Eucharist itself is. Because the Mass is a sacrifice in a sense. What it is, though, it's the sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving. It is a sacrifice of the people offering their alms to God and themselves to God. We're all offering ourselves to God within the Mass, but also it is the sacrifice insofar as it is us receiving that body and blood of Christ, who Himself is the sacrifice, and to add to it as another propitiatory sacrifice, where this is an action where we are sacrificing, and they don't say this, but you basically have to, sacrificing again Christ, that just becomes heresy. So that's something that we have to work out between Protestantism and Catholicism. I think the sort of Eucharistic sacrificial theology of Rome is very messed up.
Yeah, I just have to add to that because I really think this is a very interesting discussion, because when I was trying to discern, because I also really prefer this clear, old, more traditional understanding of apostolic succession and so on. But then when you try to move in that, at least that happened for me when I tried to move further into that more high traditional understanding of apostolic succession, and that bishops alone are the sole office able to commit ordination, then it really opened up for a lot of that Roman Catholic criticism, because then they would say, yeah, all that is nice, but that even that is not enough. You also, so in Roman Catholic sacramentology, generally you need 3 parts for the validity of the sacrament. You need the right matter, the right form, and the right intent. And they would say, so the matter of the sacrament is like, like the laying on of hands. So no, that would be the form. Sorry. Yeah, the matter would like be the guy.
The matter would be, the person himself for ordination.
Yeah, right.
So a woman can't be ordained.
Yeah, baptized male. So like if you tried to ordain a female, nothing would happen because that's invalid material. So the form is like receive the Holy Spirit and the laying on of hands. And then the intent is what you mentioned. They would, like the Roman Catholic Church would critique the Anglican Church for not having valid apostolic succession, even not having valid holy orders, not even having priests, because the proper intent is lacking. That is to say, in the Anglican understanding, there is not a wish or intent to ordain sacrificing priest offering a propitiatory sacrifice at the Eucharist. And because that intent is lacking, the Roman Catholic, the Anglican Church are not having valid ordination. I just think it's such a bad and silly argument, because if you try to go out throughout church history and look at like the intent and also the form, like the material has never changed. We luckily have not had, historically speaking, anyone come up with the crazy idea that anyone but male Christian who are baptized can't be ordained. But even when discussing the form of the sacrament, I mean, Roman Catholicism has changed their view on that. So at the Council of Florence, we see that it was the handing over of the instruments which was viewed as the form. So in the Council of Florence, there's a bull talking about defining all the sacraments. It's called the Bull of the Union with the Armenians. And they describe all the 7 sacraments, defining the matter and the form of the sacraments. And they are very explicit. The form of the sacrament of ordination is the handing on of the instruments. And we might say, like, what is that? It is that when you ordained in the old days,
the chalice and the paten.
Yeah, you would give, like, a priest. He would get the instruments used for the Eucharist, like
the chalice and the paten.
Yeah, right, exactly. And the deacon would get a Bible, and the bishop would get a ring and his staff. And Thomas Aquinas also says this. If you're reading the Summa, then he is also quite clear. Like the form of the sacrament of ordination is the traditionis instrumentorum, the handing over of the instruments, and they have just changed their view. So I mean, how can they complain about the Anglicans lacking intent when they themselves think the church can just change it to whatever they want?
I'm in dialogue with a few Roman Catholics, and I've heard some very interesting defenses of that. Not at all convinced. I think actually the stronger argument is this, because is actually this. My brother became Roman Catholic, and when he became Roman Catholic, his baptism as a Baptist was accepted, right? If you are to apply the apostolic curiae theology of ordination to baptism, the sacrament of baptism, you have to invalidate almost every baptism of every baptism of like a Baptist, for instance, covenantal types who are not holding to baptismal regeneration. You would have to deny their baptisms, but like all of these baptisms are seen as valid. And if they're not valid, then what is happening is the Roman Church has been allowing for these invalid baptisms to be counted as valid baptisms, and many of them become priests. But then those are no longer valid ordinations because they're not the valid matter, which is a baptized Christian. Of course, the confirmation as well and everything. So, like, it just becomes a major issue because there are just all of these invalid baptisms that are now being falsely recognized as valid. A Baptist does not have the same theology of baptism that a Roman Catholic, not even close. And I've again dialogued with some of my Roman friends on this, and they say, well, no, they still believe that you're being made a member of the church. I go, no. You've not seen a Baptist baptism, then, because I want to say pretty much every single Baptist baptism I've ever been a witness to, what do they say? They are vehemently reiterating their belief that baptism is not making you a member of the church. It is literally just a recognition of what's already happened.
Yes.
And I'm like, that is not the same theology as the Roman Catholic. On baptism.
No, sorry, go on.
Well, I was going to say, my theology, or any Anglican's theology of ordination, is closer to a Roman Catholic's theology of ordination than baptism is to a Roman Catholic's.
Right, yes.
Between a Baptist and because they believe it does nothing. It doesn't even make you a member of the church. And in fact, Baptists have a theology of becoming a member of the church, which is distinct from baptism. You have to first be baptized, and then you can become a member of the church.
I really think there's a lot of incongruity. And if you take this chain of thought, and please ask questions in the comments, we'll get to them in a few minutes. But I mean, if you take this chain of thought to its logical conclusion, you'll end up like the Russian Orthodox Church. They have stopped recognizing baptism of countless churches around. So, for example, one of my friends apostatized and joined the Eastern Orthodox Church, and they rebaptized him, though he was baptized with by ordained clergy with the Trinitarian formula and everything. I mean, this is just straight up Donatism. I mean,
exactly. I was about to say.
Yeah, so I mean, we have been through this before. Like, you end up with this view that the sacraments can only be validly, not licitly, but validly conferred only within the confines of the true church. So you just stop affirming the validity of the sacraments by any other church body. I mean, this is a heresy. This is just plain out heresy.
Yeah, it's redressed Donatism. The East is
Right.
is at least a bit more friendly with it, explicitly friendly with it, because they'll point just straight up to Cyprian of Carthage. I'm like, Cyprian of Carthage is basically a proto-Donatist.
Yeah, right. Yeah, he is.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Okay, times for question and answering. I'll also take a few comments so we can just maybe quickly share our thoughts to some of them. This was
my just real quick. My screen is not showing the bottom half for some reason of the video, so I won't be able to read them. So if you could just read them too.
Yes, I will. So Ancient Ancestor asks, and this was when we talked about clericalism, but he writes, the priest is not your boss, whom you have to please by showing up. He is your servant, sent from God to strengthen you so you can do what our Lord commanded.
Amen. I mean, well, I mean, I would say that he's also your boss in the spiritual sense, but like I don't think it's either or. I think
exactly.
It is servant leadership. Yeah. So.
Yeah, right. Because I mean, Hebrews literally say, obey your leaders. So naturally, like, the priest is a boss in a certain sense. But I don't think he's trying to say that the priest is not a boss in any way. But this is, as we talked about earlier, this is just to emphasize the downward direction of the service of the divine service, namely God serves us with his holy sacraments, with the forgiveness of sins, and we praise and respond to him. So that is like getting the liturgy right. Then so this is Meister Arndt. He says American Lutherans were way too reactionary against Bishop Stephen, the Bishop Stephen situation. We now have district presidents instead of bishops. Worst downgrade ever made. I don't know. Are you familiar with the situation with the Missouri Synod and Bishop Stephen?
I don't know the situation with Bishop Stephen, but I am familiar with sort of things like diocesan presidents and things like that. Like, I think supervisor is the word used for United Methodists, for instance. So just use the word bishop.
Yeah, it's just stupid, right? So it was really sad. So one of the largest Lutheran church bodies in America, just for our European listeners who might not be aware, are called the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, and they're quite big in the States, and they are a very good confessional body. My church is in communion with the Missouri Synod, but when it was founded by Germans coming over, fleeing Prussia and the more like Enlightenment despot king, and they actually brought a valid bishop with them to continue having the Episcopal church structure, because they were good Lutherans. They didn't want to get rid of the bishops. Then something horrible happened. The bishop was caught sleeping around with the different wives.
I've heard of this now. I remember.
Yeah, of this small colony, and they were good Lutherans, so they submitted him to church discipline and actually excommunicated him and sent him out of their colony. But then they had a problem like that. They had excommunicated their bishop, and they only had like this one bishop. And then they had to figure out, like, can we continue and so on. So that was why the Missouri Synod has historically had a much stronger emphasis on more congregationalist policy. And then nowadays they have district presidents and so on. And all these stupid terms, just use the historic terms. Just call it a bishop, man. I mean, he is a bishop.
Exactly.
Then we also have, yes. So Meister Arndt, he also says, let's get these Swedish bishops to mass ordain priests in America and Denmark.
There you go. I'm down with that. No, I mean, the ELCA is obviously very liberal and not confessionally Lutheran. And we have the same problem with the Episcopal Church. But that being said, the Episcopal Church and the ELCA actually have a relationship with each other to where they sort of do co-ordinations and co-consecrations. And are you familiar with the North American Lutheran Church, NALC?
Yeah.
All right. So the ACNA has a cozy relationship where they're trying to have the same thing with them, where there are co-ordinations and things like that. And we're wanting to eventually get to where we can sort of help them have their own bishops in apostolic succession. So, like, and the NALC is a bit more liberal than obviously LCMS, but like the point being that like there's that desire to sort of help spread the Episcopal ordinations.
Yeah, and I think this is a dilemma for me. So I have finished my theological studies, and I hope to become a pastor someday. I mean, I could easily just like go to the state church in Denmark and be ordained by a bishop, but I just can't do that in good conscience because it's heretical. It's a church body giving God's blessing to same-sex unions against his clear word. It's a church body ordaining women both to the priesthood and also, well, they aren't ordained, trying to ordain them to the priesthood and even the bishopric. I mean, I just can't do it. So I would rather be ordained by a pious priest than a valid bishop with apostolic succession who's a heretic. But I would also say I do think this is a false dilemma because you should have both. You should be ordained by a pious Orthodox bishop with apostolic succession. You shouldn't be forced to choose between either or. So, for example, the Mission province in Sweden is a small Lutheran church body, and they have valid apostolic succession in the traditional sense by the ordination of bishops. So yeah, I do think it's a good and nice thing to have and get that. Yeah.
I'll definitely keep you in prayer for that. Yeah, we need more Orthodox clergymen. So yeah.
Right. Then we have a comment that's probably to you. It's a bit critical. Good night, OG writes, I would have joined Anglicanism, but I can't imagine myself being in communion with sacramentarians.
So I'm trying to remember. Sacramentarian would be somebody who denies the efficacy of the sacraments, or
well, yeah, or just like the real presence,
okay,
having more low reformed view of the Eucharist, for example.
okay. So if sacramentarian would include Calvin as a sacramentarian, it would. All right.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't agree with Calvin's theology of the Eucharist, but I don't think it's so far to be heretical. I would agree much more with the Lutherans on that. It's just something we just sort of have to keep as attention, unfortunately, because both positions are allowed in professional standards. But yeah, I mean, I'd be Lutheran except for the fact that you guys don't have valid bishops. So.
What? Okay, so if there was an Orthodox, like imagine the Missouri Synod, but with an archbishop and bishops and so on.
No, I'd still be Anglican. So I visited a Lutheran Missouri Synod parish before I became Anglican. Because I visited a variety of denominations and checked them out and stuff like that. And what drew me to Anglicanism was the liturgy itself, specifically. And from there, I saw like, oh, this has everything that I've been looking for, that I was looking for within the Eastern Orthodox, but also I still get to retain my Protestant convictions of justification and things like that. So if I knew of a Lutheran church that had sort of a valid bishop and stuff like that, for me, I would still want to maintain being Anglican because I have everything I want to need within the Anglican tradition. It's been good to me. That being said, my hope is to build a sort of Anglican and Lutheran sort of dialogue that eventually there's sort of like full intercommunion and working out of the differences of theology and all that stuff, to where we can agree much more and be just sort of a standard of formal communion as well. Like that's my ultimate goal. Not ultimate, but that's one of my goals. You're muted again.
Oh, sorry. Thanks. Yeah, thank you for saying that. I mean, if I was not Lutheran, I would be Anglican, definitely, because I mean, we are just, at least in my view, the
Yeah.
two traditions closest to one another. I
Oh,
would,
definitely.
yeah, I would pretty much only have one criticism of Anglicanism, and that is that it tends to be way too loose on unity of faith. That is to say,
Yeah.
the confessional statements are just way too broad, and I mean, in Lutherans, we are probably like one of the traditions most strict, especially like confessional
Yeah.
Lutherans about like closed communion, and we just have to agree on almost anything. But I really think that is nice because like church unity is a product and consequence of the unity of faith, and they kind of have to go hand in hand, at least in my view. So that would pretty much be the only criticism I would have of Anglicanism. But yeah, that is probably
What's funny, yeah. What's interesting though is that this question of unity was not a problem until the 20th century. So it's not. I don't think it's due to our confessional standards. Like you see it beginning to crack a little bit maybe in the 19th century, but it's really, I would say, something that happens in the 20th century.
well, what about the whole
I don't think.
controversy with the Puritans and so on? I mean, they should just have been excommunicated, but they were
So,
within the Church of England for a long time.
well, what happens is there's a range of Puritanism, right? You've got what what's ending up happening is that we've got our sort of system and our confessional standards, and there are people who are trying to push against those confessional standards. And what eventually ends up being is the English Civil War. Like that's what
Yeah,
that's what
right.
leads to it. That's what it leads
Yeah.
to. So there is a war that we fight over it, and because of that war, we're just sort of like, okay, we're going to give religious freedom. So now you Presbyterians can do what you want, and you Reformed Baptists can do what you want. For good or for ill or whatever. But you don't really see like so that's when those Puritans sort of lead, you could say, the non-conformists and such like for that. So you don't see sort of this major sort of like, oh well, you can believe whatever you want kind of thing until the 20th century. But with all that being said, I think one of the reasons I'm not Lutheran is actually because of the sort of the same problem, the opposite, which is I
Yeah.
think that the confessional standards are too tight.
Yeah, too strict. Yeah.
I cannot in good conscience say that someone who is a Calvinist should not receive Holy Communion because of his Eucharistic theology. Like I just cannot in good conscience say that. If I'm going to refuse somebody communion, the reason is that like what I am saying in refusing somebody communion is that I think that you are actually on your way to hell. So
Yeah.
I can't say that with somebody because they have a Calvinistic understanding. As much as I disagree with the Calvinistic understanding, I don't think that holding to that position means you're going. So
Okay, yeah, that's good. I mean, because I could never imagine giving communion to somebody who's reformed. I mean, I do believe,
interesting.
yeah, I would never be able to do that. I do believe that it is a very clear and explicit heresy. So I would, I wouldn't mind refusing communion to those, but I would also grab on to the distinction you made and say this is a damnable heresy, but it's not as if I can say that you're going to hell. I can say there's grave danger there, but I would not want to go any further than that. But I mean, this is just like a real difference between Lutheranism and Anglicanism, and something which could be nice to discuss at a later point, because there's so much good stuff to grab onto here. But I do think it's good to get some of these differences out, because there's so much uniting us. There's so much commonality, but there are also some important differences. Now, this is not really a question, but a comment. I just wanted to take it in here, because I do think it's a nice display of Christian life. So, Corner Spyridon, who was active with you in the comment section yesterday. Well, not yesterday, in the stream I did with Eric Ibarra. He says, he writes, I just want to say sorry to Father James the other day. I wasn't a troll. Sorry if it came across that way, and I apologize.
Oh, well, you're forgiven. I don't remember who it was exactly. I started blocking a few people because of so understand this. I am very often targeted by people online, especially on YouTube, because I've given critiques against Roman theology, and so I've just heard every single thing. Ha ha ha! Your church was started by a horny king, who wanted a divorce. Women's ordination, lesbian bishop. I've heard every single one, and it gets very frustrating and annoying because I'm having to constantly sort of give the same answers, and it just ends up being like, why would you want to start a church that wasn't started by Christ or whatever? I'm like, I don't believe that we started a new church, and so it just I get tired of these sorts of.
No, I think it's fine. Yeah. I think it's fine. I just really like it when we Christians can come together and clear up misunderstanding and make sure that there's good faith again. Because like the next comment was a reply to Sparan. It talks about you, and it says, can't blame him. He gets trolled 90% of the time by papists online. So, right. I mean, it's fair. I just really like it when we Christians can come together, show charity, and say sorry. I mean, and try to get some clarity where there has been misunderstanding. I really like that. So I just wanted. It was quite wholesome. Okay, here's a real question.
Let me. If I could really quickly.
Yes.
I forgot that I haven't started this one yet, but I did purchase this a while back. This is actually Ibarra's book on Melchizedek and Last Supper. It's about the Eucharistic sacrifice, the theology of that. I'm interested in reading it because I have a lot of respect for Ibarra in many ways. Yeah. So I do want to read that book. I've got it, but I haven't started.
Yeah, he is so nice and smart. So we have a question here. Question: how hard would it be to get the various leaders of the confessional Lutheran bodies to get together and receive ordination from a Swedish bishop with apostolic succession? Yeah, well, yeah, it's a good question. I can't talk about the practicality of it but I do think this is something we should aim for. So, for example, I do think it would be very important. So, for example, we have a large sister church in Germany. When they are going to ordain their new archbishop, because they have an archbishop and then like bishops beneath him, because it's a larger church. Selk, it's called Selbstständige Evangelische Kirche in Evangelische Lutherische Kirche, whatever. And it would be very nice when they ordain their new archbishop that they would ask the Swedish bishop to come and ordain him, because the Mission province has bishops with valid apostolic succession. Also, the Lutheran Church in Latvia, there's Jarius, I think he's called. They also have an archbishop in a very large. It's kind of like, it's so cool. It's the old regional Lutheran church, which became very liberal in the 90s, allowed women ordination, but they have the pendulum has swung back. So now they have forbidden the ordination of women and so on. And they also have an archbishop with valid apostolic succession. So I think we Lutherans should make a strong effort to come together, and in the ordination of each other's bishops should aim towards retaining and getting apostolic succession back.
My bishop has actually spoken with that. I forgot, was it Latvia you said it was? Or
yeah,
Latvia. Yeah, he's spoken with them, and we're in talks of communion with each other. The Reformed Episcopal Church and the Latvian.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Okay, that sounds interesting.
Yeah. And I knew I'm 99% sure it's them, because he was talking about how it was a Lutheran church group that did quote ordain women that then got rid of the practice eventually, and sort of has made a comeback into being more traditional. So, well, praise God for that.
Yeah, right. But okay, communion with a Reformed Anglican Church. Yeah, that would
Well, the
create.
Reformed Episcopal Church. Let me clarify. The Reformed Episcopal Church. That's our name, but we are not like sort of Calvinists.
No, right. Yeah,
Like
yeah. I know. I
yeah,
know. Yeah, but yeah. Okay. Okay. Very interesting because then, yeah, yeah, that would be a bit spicy to swallow for the confessional
yeah.
Lutherans at least.
We haven't like done full communion,
No,
but
no.
we're in the talks.
Yes. And I do believe it's important to have those conversations going on,
Yeah.
even when you can't get full church fellowship yet. Um, let's say if there are any more questions. I do think that was the last question. So thank you so much for coming on, Father,
Yeah, sure.
and
Thank you for having me.
yeah, and for sharing your time with us and all your insights. It was very interesting and very, very fruitful, I think. So God bless you and your ministry. If you want to here present your YouTube channel, or if you want to mention anything here at the end, then I'll let you do that. But again, just thank you so much for being generous with your time.
Yeah. So if you want more reading on it, I would recommend as a sort of intro to sort of apostolic succession and things like that, what are known as the tracts for the times from the Tractarians of the 19th century. We're talking about John Keble, um, Edward Pusey, and John Henry Newman when he was better, not when he became a papist. Yeah, I don't like him as a papist at all. I don't even like him before he became a papist because I don't think he's the best thinker. Like Pusey is much better. Pusey is a much better tractate. So definitely start with Pusey. But that'd be a good sort of like just a sort of intro to sort of my vein of Anglicanism, our thoughts on things like apostolic succession, on the sacraments, etc. Again, my channel is Barely Protestant. It's a YouTube channel. I have Patreon. Um, keep me in prayer. I haven't posted a video in about 3 weeks or so. Part of that is, well, I had COVID, and I'm just finally recovered from it. But also just school. I teach also, and I'm getting ready to move. And I'm still not sure exactly where God is moving me. It could still be in California. It could be back at the South. So I've just been more preoccupied with all that sort of stuff. So I've not posted a video in a few weeks, but I plan to be doing one this week. But yeah, if you like learning more about Anglicanism, about historic sort of Protestantism, uh, arguments against sort of Roman theology, that's been the primary thing that I've been doing recently, all that sort of stuff, then yeah, check out the channel.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. I work as a farmer also here on a homestead, and I have a lot of time for listening to audio resources. So I've been listening to a lot of your videos while tending the bees or plowing the fields or whatnot. So yeah, I can highly recommend your YouTube channel. That's some really good content. So thank you so much for that. And we'll keep you in our prayers. Hopefully, we will also pray for your internet connection that it will be better.
It'll be a lot better once I move out of California.
Right? Yes. Yes. Exactly. And yes. So thank you so much, and for coming on the stream. Hopefully, we can continue another time. There's a lot of stuff to discuss. But yeah, thank you so much, and